Today, we're going to talk about borderline personality disorder, how to tell whether or not you have that in your relationship, why it's a social disorder rather than a personality disorder, and how OLNE style relationship deals with it. And more importantly, whether or not someone actually has borderline personality disorder, how you can manage symptoms that appear to be borderline personality disorder in your relationships, which unironically are just good relationship practices for happy, fulfilling, and loving relationships. The reason I thought of this topic is because I saw the movie Die My Love with Jennifer Lawrence and Robert Pattinson yesterday, and it's such a fucking good movie. You have to see it. The premise of the movie being a relationship which appears normal but has some quirks in the beginning that demonstrates signs of instability. And it's a great depiction of how the mind works of someone with a disorder. And I believe the movie demonstrates so well why borderline personality disorders are more of a social phenomena rather than a personality disorder. And inevitably, it shows why BPD, borderline personality disorder, has such a high rate of successful treatment. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor or a licensed therapist, so this is entirely for entertainment and education purposes. I highly and strongly recommend if you're experiencing any of this, you seek out a good therapist. And a good therapist is just good protocol to have if it's something you can manage in your life. I want you to look at it as rather than an emergency protocol, having a therapist, have a therapist as a part of your team, much like you have a general practitioner doctor or you have a dentist, or if you're in business, you have a lawyer. You should also have a therapist, even if you don't experience an adverse mental illness. So first, I'm going to read to you the definition by DSM-5 of what a borderline personality disorder. It's characterized by a pervasive pattern of instability in relationships, self-image, and emotions, along with notable impulsivity. To be diagnosed with this requires at least 5 of 9 specific criteria by the DSM. And the criteria are the following. Number 1, fear of abandonment, unstable and intense relationships that switch between idealization and devaluation. In other words, someone is incredibly amazing or someone sucks, and there's no in between. An unstable self-image, impulsive behaviors when it comes to spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, or binge eating, suicidal or self-harming behaviors, rapid mood changes, persistent feelings of emptiness, problems controlling anger, and number 9, stress-related paranoia or dissociation. These symptoms appear usually by early adulthood and affect various areas of the person's life and cause significant distress or functional impairment. So first, let's go over the role of trauma and environment in forming someone with a borderline personality disorder. And this is from the work of Sam Vaknin, who's written several books on narcissism, and he emphasizes that BPD is often viewed as a post-traumatic condition resulting from early childhood trauma and abuse. Scholars suggest that it's an elaborate form of complex PTSD. CPTSD. The diagnosis, Sam says, is relational because the criteria define how the individual behaves in society and relationships, rather than purely individual deficits. The core issue of BPD involves difficulties in identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. He says that although BPD is 40 to 50% inheritable, which means that someone can have it from a genetic or cerebral predisposition, he sees it as the environmental factors are the crucial elements and determinants for its development. And if when you watch the movie Die My Love, it is an incredible thing to think about. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's so good, you got to see it. It is such a good depiction. The specific contributing factors to BPD are childhood maltreatment, poor maternal attachment, maternal separation or sexual abuse, or paternal substance abuse, or inappropriate family boundaries. The most frequent being emotional neglect, and emotional abuse. And this idea that it's a social disorder, I believe, is the reason why it has a higher chance of success rate as opposed to NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, which it's been referred to as a hopeless disorder. The reason why is because when a child is forming their identity of their self and they can't rely on their caretaker, primarily their mother, to form an identity, they create what Sam calls a false self. So there's your true self and then there's your false self, and you create this false self because your true self is too painful. You don't get the love that you would like. So you create a false self which has all the identities that you would like, primarily because you're growing. You don't know much about the world except for your caretaker, primarily your mother. And this false self has the attributes, primarily of mother, but attributes that create safety. As the child grows up, this false self becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, more prevalent, pervasive, and the true self, the core, diminishes further and further and further until this false self has consumed the individual, and the narcissist no longer has the ability to see reality as it is, instead how he believes from the perspective of the false self how reality should be. Therefore, everything that happens to them goes through the filter of the narcissistic false self, which began as a defense mechanism. And the reason why it's such a low chance of being treated is because if you remove their false self, their true self has already been so diminished that if they were to remove their false self, which is their identity, they would be left with nothing. And they call this an emptiness. And so no one wants to feel empty, especially someone who has developed such pervasive false self and no true self that they will protect it at all costs. Going back to borderline personality disorder, here's a problem when it comes to identity. The BPD person has an instability in their self-image called identity disturbance. And this is coupled with relational functions. The individual fails to create a stable core identity, something called a self-formulation failure. Consequently, the borderline person constantly rely on external regulation, which means they rely on others to regulate their moods. And furthermore, these are things like outsourcing psychological processes, like emotion control and emotional stability, to an intimate partner or what they call a special or favorite person. This is also a specific disorder, the favorite person. And I'll go over how OLNE deals with this. So when it comes to how it's adapted socially, Sam interprets it as positive adaptations when they occur because they occur in a mentally sick, dysfunctional, and pathologized society. Interestingly, BPD could be less prevalent in traditional cultures because they offer more resources for emotional support, which makes it a protective against this form of disorder. So here's what to do in relationships to be able to manage someone who has symptoms of BPD, not necessarily having a clinical diagnosis. Since people with BPD typically rely on their partners to outsource external regulation, the partner has to actively manage the relationship dynamic to provide stability and model healthy psychological functioning. However, a delicate balance has to be maintained because the borderline fears both abandonment anxiety and rejection sensitivity, and simultaneously engulfment and enmeshment. All that means is when they disappear into the partner, they enmesh, they fuse. So the partner has to establish an ambience and an environment of presence, constancy, permanence, stability, and predictability. Be a stable rock. The partner acts as a secure base of the relationship and the borderline's reality testing. This means being constantly present and available as the borderline interprets even brief absences as abandonment. They must ensure object consistency. You could use rituals and routines, organization management, which provides structure. And to protect from engulfment or enmeshment, they must not be dominant or domineering, While providing stability, they must avoid being overbearing, controlling, or micromanaging, because that triggers engulfment anxiety, causing the borderline to react by something called acting out. And this is showed a lot in the movie towards the middle and the end of the movie. So here are some ways a partner can challenge and correct the person's borderline's psychological defenses. One, they have to decatastrophize and restore reality, because a borderline reacts to catastrophizing imagination. Because remember, a borderline anticipates abandonment all the time, rather than present reality. Partner must bring them back to the present moment. I wrote a blog post on how specific OLNE measures and the book OLNE, which I would encourage you and them to read, because it provides strategies and measures that ultimately prevent enmeshment, engulfment, and communication styles that prevent fears of abandonment and rejection sensitivity. The partner must insist on reality as a consistency or consistent reminder, and to deal with splitting, something called splitting, which is more like dichotomous thinking. Either it's good or bad, this or that, nothing. There's no nuance. You must constantly remind them that, one must remind oneself that everything has nuance. When it comes to the narcissist, everything is their way or the highway, and there's no nuance. And OLNE provides an amazing platform for this, which is regulating external control, or rather, regulating external locus of control, because a borderline outsources responsibility. And remember, the primary premise of an OLNE relationship is that authority equals responsibility. Because a borderline outsources responsibility, they use their partner as a scapegoat, which is also called alloplastic defense. So the partner must lovingly but firmly refuse to accept responsibility of the borderline person's moods, misbehavior, or emotions. The partner must encourage the borderline to adopt autoplastic defenses. In other words, taking responsibility by changing, when they say in their language, phrases like, "This happened to me, I'm the victim," to something like, "This is something I can take responsibility of." Not the partner taking responsibility, but the person who sees themselves as victim as taking responsibility and ownership. The borderline is also overwhelmed with emotions and often experience brain fog because she can't label or contain her feelings. So the partner must help the borderline talk and label their emotions. Such things like, how are you feeling? Are you feeling rage or fear? Putting feelings into words. Something in the book OLNE describes as a communication strategy. This gives the borderline person control over them. The relationship must establish communication protocols. You gotta use rigid and strict protocols that prohibit personal attacks and insist instead of speaking about the person's internal state rather than attacking a partner. What could that sound like? It sound like this: I'm in pain, and then incorporating what in the book OLNE calls OFNR, observe feeling need request. Extreme cases of BPD involves amnesia and dissociation. So a partner could encourage the use of video footage or video recordings or constant programmed reminders to help the borderline person establish a thread of memory and identity. Journaling also helps tremendously well. On your iPhone, you can use a journal app, and rather than take copious amounts of time in journaling, writing, you could just voice dictate. The other cool thing about an OLNE relationship is that it removes traditional hierarchy structures of relationship models, those things that reinforce the dynamics that exacerbates BPD. For example, because monogamy establishes that love has to be conditional and exclusive, the person with BPD, fear of abandonment. Also, monogamy encourages enmeshment, which exacerbates a borderline personality disorder. Fear of engulfment, and it's because enmeshment feels like security, so securing at first, and then it becomes suffocating. Feel familiar? These dynamics create the same push-pull trauma loop that caused the instability in the first place. And a typical traditional relationship demands emotional self-regulation, something a borderline has not yet learned because their environment never modeled it. because OLNE encourages using communication strategies and techniques and tools helps someone, whether or not they have borderline personality disorder, co-regulate in a healthy manner. Here's how the premises of OLNE helps BPD symptoms. Firstly, the first establishing non-conditional love. One's genuine wanting and desire for their beloved's happiness, well-being, and actualization of both parties. Love is given without condition, without stipulation or clauses or exclusivity, without control or fear of loss. Remember, the borderline's core wound is fear of rejection and abandonment. OLNE dissolves this entirely by removing ownership and conditionality of that love. Number two establishment is not non-judgmental acceptance. Instead of pathologizing emotional swings, the partner learns to co-regulate. The partner becomes a stable rock, predictable, grounded, gently modeling self-trust without dominance. Finally, open communication. Each person's ability to communicate about anything and everything they would like without fear of psychological punishment or emotional blackmail. Secrecy fuels dysregulation, especially someone with borderline. Furthermore, reality constancy restores reality testing. When partners can be open about speaking their desires and fears, the borderline person catastrophizing imagination loses its grip. Finally, an OLNE relationship offers structure without control. Rituals and constancy in an OLNE relationship help build constancy for the borderline, which is the ability to believe that love remains even when the partner is absent. And this comes from the structures in OLNE of mutual agreements and check-ins, and they're not from hierarchy or obligation. So to close this video long enough, don't look at BPD as someone is broken. Most people will exhibit symptoms of BPD. Because remember, when we were children, our caretakers were still young people, considering 20s and 30s still to be young. So they haven't mastered psychology. So you may have fears of abandonment and rejection sensitivity, and that's okay. Look at BPD symptoms as relational injury. And because it was learned from relationships, it can only be healed through relationships. So open style of relationships like OLNE, when practiced consciously. Again, read the book OLNE with your partner. It recreates the social conditions that BPD never had. Presence without possession, freedom without fear, truth without punishment. When love stops demanding compliance and starts modeling stability, even the most dysregulated nervous systems can learn to trust again. Share this video with other people. You're helping make the world a better place. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments or send me a message. See you on next piece video. Bye.